What's up, guys? Welcome back to this EVO build series. In this video, we're going to cover a bit of the wiring process and getting things back in place. We're going to swap out our OEM fuel rail with this Radium rail that came with the car. And we're going to do a little drivetrain work. We're going to get our intermediate shaft put back in place and get our CV shafts in place and do some more suspension work. So the first thing we're going to do is actually get our slave cylinder in place and bolted up. Now this is what came on the car. Again, I'm taking a risk here, hoping some of the stuff was good. This did have the aftermarket line, braided stainless steel line ran to it, at least partially anyway, from the master cylinder out to that part of the transmission. And I just went ahead and bolted everything down. Next, we moved on to the shifter cable and the shifter cable bracket here. I usually don't really pop off the cables from the bracket, but that's the way this car came. But it was pretty simple to do either way. I just bolted that bracket down in place and then snapped the cables in where they should go. And these cables, I think, had the same bushings that I put in the Silver EVO as well. I think they were Torque Solutions, but other brands make them as well. Just these more solid shifter bushings put in place. They seem to be in pretty good shape, so I just kind of slid those on, of course, and put the cotter pids in, and then did some quick testing. Made sure everything shifted all right. Next, we got this little harness here. This is the wiring harness for our transmission. One is the speed sensor here, and the other two, one of them kind of I think just connects to the main harness, and the other one I believe is a reverse switch sensor. And here you can see where those are after I bolted them in place. This speed sensor one does have one of those metal clips that you would put on to help hold in place, make sure it doesn't pop off. I put that in, didn't film it though because it's a bit harder to see just because of that position. Digging into the rest of the wiring here, this obviously most of this is some of the electrical stuff that either runs to the battery or the starter or the alternator. And these pieces here now are the ones that are going to run towards the alternator. So I'm going to run these wires underneath the intake manifold, run them back towards the alternator. Another hard place to kind of see in film, but I did that off camera. And then I ran the other part of this harness down towards the starter and bolted it up to my starter. And I ran this other portion of the harness that runs over from the driver's side to the passenger side. You can see where it runs here, running down the bottom portion of where our core support is for our radiator. And then, yes, I plugged in some stuff to power steering and ran things over for our other headlight. This connection here, just connecting the kind of the two pieces of the harnesses here. And then on the other side, on the driver's side here, again, just making these connection points too. This is another point where I'm really glad I have the other car so I can reference it if I need to. It's always good to obviously have another wiring harness. A lot of the stuff is pretty obvious, but sometimes it can be a little confusing as to which way the wires kind of should be ran. And I'm sure I'll run into that even more so when it comes to putting all the dash stuff back together when I do the wiring in there. Moving on to swap out the fuel rail. This one, as you can see, I got my 1250cc high Z injectors in and was running them on the stock fuel rail. Worked just fine. I could leave it, but this other rail that came with the car is a Radium rail with a fuel pulse dampener installed with it as well. So I should be able to use that. So I went ahead and pulled out the old rail, put my fuel injectors back in place. You put a little bit of oil typically on the O-rings that are on the top of these injectors just so they don't potentially rip or anything. So I'm going to put a little bit of dab of oil on each one of those as well before I put the fuel rail back in place. So of course, just lining things up, getting that fuel rail set on. There is one thing I don't really like about this fuel rail, and it's that hose that connects to the feed hose that connects to the end. It's a little bit twisted. I'm not sure why it seems so twisted. It seems like it pinches it off a little bit. So I'm definitely gonna have to look into that a little bit later, but for now, I just wanted to get this kind of mounted up and in place. And once the fuel rail was in place, I could move on to more of the wiring. And of course, we're going to wire up. This is going to be with the injectors, running the wires to our injectors, running wires to everything that bolts to our intake manifold as well. One of these clips had a little broken portion of it, one of these injector clips, so that's a little bit of a bummer, but I think with the metal piece that holds these on, it should be just fine. Hopefully it doesn't give us any issues, but definitely something to watch for. I'll pay attention to it. So kind of had to just continually pull this harness over and then try to line it up best I could as to where I figured it should go in place. There are connection points where it would connect to the valve cover as well. And then I ran the harness part that runs up front here, plugging in our cam angle sensor. and there's a ground wire on there as well. This cam angle sensor plug-in too just kind of never actually clips in place. It just kind of pops out all the time. So that is another thing I'm gonna have to watch for. Might need the old zip tie there to hold that in place. We'll see. Next, back to the intake manifold, plugging in our map sensor and then our throttle position sensor. Those wires run over the top. I mistakenly ran the wires underneath initially, ran them underneath the throttle body, and then figured out that wouldn't work to run the rest of the harness over for my fuel injectors. So now they ran the right way. Magic of video editing though, I didn't make you guys watch me do it wrong. And here you can see the little clips I was referring to. You want to make sure you get those clips in place. If your car doesn't have them, they are pretty cheap and easy to get. It's definitely worth making sure you have those in place, just because I was drag racing once when actually my throttle position sensor one here that I'm working on right now actually popped off, and like it screwed up my run. I didn't know what was wrong, and it was because I didn't have a clip on there to hold in place. So that connection point just popped off. So make sure you have those clips in place. And finally, the coil packs, we're just going to go ahead and plug in our coil packs on each side as well. And that's about it for underneath the hood. Now we're going to move back to some drivetrain stuff. And this is our intermediate shaft. It comes out a lot harder than it goes in. So the good news is it goes in easy. If you're not sure which end to put in, which way it goes, I'd say just look for the end that actually has threads in it. The one that has threads in it is kind of so you could pull it out. So you know that the side with the threads is the side that's going to face outward. And of course, we're going to clean this up a little bit before we install it and just put a little oil on it as well, just so it slides in a bit easier. And to make the whole process easier as well, just going to remove my strut and take those 2 bolts out. So it's just easier to get in there. I'm going to need to do that either way to actually get the CV shaft in place. So it's a bit tough to see again, but I'm sliding that intermediate shaft in place and just pushing in most of the way with my hands. And then I'm just going to give it a tap with a plastic hammer, or rubber hammer, if you will, to tap it in place. If you want to double check it, you give it a little pull. It shouldn't just pull right out. It should be harder to get out. Now, because the car was kind of rolling around a little bit without CV shafts in it, we had built these kind of spacers. Well, spacers is the wrong word. I can't think of the word right now, but we built these to hold the wheel bearings in place just so they wouldn't kind of fall apart if you're rolling the car without CV shafts. But of course, we're putting the front CV shafts in, so we're going to take these out of the way. And now we're going to put in our CV shafts. These are OEM front CV shafts, which is good. You can tell by the green and kind of just the way that they're not perfectly circular on that part that I mentioned is green. You'll see it a little better on the other side as well. These OEM shafts, when they're in good shape, they usually last for quite a long time, and they're hold up pretty good compared to some of the aftermarket ones. So I'm glad this one has it. I think the silver car had the OEM CV shaft on the driver's side, but not on the passenger side. But this red car came with the OEM shafts either way, so I'm using the ones that came with the red car. So we're going to get that lined up and then give it some taps to get it in place. It shouldn't be too hard to get it to snap in place. Just make sure it's lined up and kind of as even as possible before you really try to push that in. I know people don't always like the tap method that I'm using there. You could use a rubber hammer again or whatever, but usually if you don't pound it too hard, just kind of pulling it back and forth and pushing it in like that, it usually works fine, but I believe you could damage it that way if you were applying too much force or if it wasn't lined up correctly. Now, just going to put a little bit of anti-seize on those threads before we put it into our hub assembly here. And once we have that CV shaft in place, we should be able to just lift up this assembly and then get one of our bolts in to hold everything up. And we're going to tighten up those bolts. I imagine you've watched some other suspension videos of mine, but pay attention to what bolt you put in where. The top bolt does kind of have that protruding part on it that can go in one way or the other to affect your alignment. So make sure you put that top bolt in correctly. If you want more information on that, you could watch my suspension install video where I installed coilovers. That goes over that in more detail. Now some sway bar links, just getting these in place for now. I might swap them out later. I don't know. They seem ugly, of course, but I don't think they're in actually too bad a condition. So I'm going to put these sway bar links in place, just bolting them up to our lower control arm here. And then, of course, getting the other end through our sway bar. And we want to tighten those up as well. And the final step on the driver's side here, we're going to put this axle nut in place. But of course, I'm actually not going to put it on all the way. I'm going to leave it obviously loose. Once I have some brakes in place, I can use the brakes and do that so then I can torque those down. But for now, I actually want to leave them obviously loose just so I know to come back and tighten them later. Now we're going to move over to the passenger side and do, pretty much the same thing. loosen up our strut, remove those bolts, and give it a little tap. Here's a clear shot of the difference between like an OEM CV shaft and an aftermarket one. You can see that one here, the bottom one, the lower one is an aftermarket one. That green, again, is OEM. So we're going to go ahead and throw in that OEM CV shaft. Same process the other side. Make sure you line it up and then give it some taps to get it in place past that little C-clip, C-clamp, whatever you call it, that actually keeps it held in place. And the other side again, I like to put a little anti-seize in there just to hopefully keep things from getting rusted in place. And then we'll line it up and get our strut reconnected to our spindle. And then same thing here with our axle nut. We're going to go ahead and put that on as well, but we're going to leave it loose because, again, got to make sure I tighten them up once I have brakes so I can keep it from spinning, so I can just torque it down to the proper torque specs. And there you have it, everybody. That's it for this episode. I know it's not the most intriguing, not the most exciting stuff, not as fun as ripping apart a rusty car or as much fun as actually dropping in an engine and stuff like that. But hey, you know, dedicated to the process here. Just want to document everything as I go. Hopefully some little tidbits here might help you out if you're building in your EVO, or if you're just here for the entertainment. That might be lacking a little bit, but hey, or you find different things entertaining. But either way, I appreciate you watching. As always, this is Paul from Boosted Films saying thanks so much for watching. I just want to say that domestic violence is never okay. If you or someone you know is experiencing issues with a partner and doesn't feel safe, please visit the website thehotline.org or call 1-800-799-SAFE.